Hello there and welcome to the first episode of the Long Live Rock and Roll podcast. My name's Laz Michaelides and with me is my esteemed co-host, Mr. Felipe Amorim.
How you doing, Hello everyone, I'm fine, and you, Lars?
Yeah, not bad man, it's been good. We had a nice weekend, haven't we?
Yeah.
Felipe's been over, we had some meat, quite a lot of meat.
Exactly.
Yeah, watched some Formula 1 and we got the Formula 1 to watch today, which would be good, wouldn't it?
Yeah, Formula 1, rock and roll, good food. Doesn't get any better than that, does it?
Better than sex, drugs and rock and roll, right?
Not quite sure. Can I say that?
You can. So welcome to our podcast. This is the first episode of the Long Live Rock and Roll podcast. Just to give you guys an idea of what we're going to aim to do with this podcast is that myself and Felipe, we are big lovers of rock and roll music, aren't we? Which is a very broad term.
All sorts of rock and roll, I'd say.
Yeah. And we are very big fans of the old 60s and 70s rock and roll, aren't we? And got everything, right? Queen, Zeppelin, Cream, just we love it all. And as you have probably read in our bio and in our what this show is about, we believe that rock and roll is unfortunately taking a back seat in today's society and it's getting overlooked by quite a bit of modern music. There's good modern music, don't get us wrong. There's plenty of good stuff going around, but we believe that a lot of it came and was influenced by the good bands in those 60s and 70s era, the Beatles, you know, all that good stuff, the Kinks, the Rolling Stones, the Who,
but
everyone.
We still have some good stuff, but as I said, it might be taking the back seat now, but there's still some good stuff out there which we might talk about, innit?
Exactly. So this show, we just hope and aim to, well, we're going to do some album reviews, we're going to discuss some bands, we're going to have some debates about, you know, certain categories and aspects of rock and roll, but all in due course. We're going to...
Basically, all things rock and roll.
All things rock and roll, that's it. So again, welcome, and this is the Long Live Rock and Roll podcast. So we thought we'd start off today by saying and asking the question, what is rock and roll?
What is rock and roll? That's
the title of this episode, we called it Rock and Roll is Dead. Felipe, do you want to take us on why we decided to name this episode?
You can say rock and roll is dead. I mean, I'll be honest, I thought that would be a good title because it's shocking.
Yeah. Rock
and roll is dead. And also that's something that has been... Oh, it's dead! Oh.
What can I do?
No. Someone killed rock and roll. Was it hip-hop? Was it Taylor Swift? Who killed rock and roll? Honestly, that's something that it's not the first time people say rock and roll is dead. And that has been said many times in the history of music. I remember clearly watching Pink Floyd live at Pompeii, and there's some scenes from them like recording The Dark Side of the Moon. So you would kind of think that when Pink Floyd was recording The Dark Side of the Moon, there was like a magic moment for the history of rock and roll. But then there's
was that 1973?
Yeah.
So there were so many moments that we still think, wow, early
that's
70s, great rock and roll stuff.
Exactly, and Dark Side of the Moon, come on. And then you have Roger Waters saying something to the camera like, yeah, they're saying rock and roll is dead again, but every 10 years someone says that, etc. So wait a minute. People were saying that rock and roll is dead when Pink Floyd was recording The Dark Side of the Moon. So people are going to always claim that rock and roll is dead or is not relevant anymore. But I believe rock and roll is always going to be relevant and will always be relevant, and it will always be appreciated by quite a lot of people because it does have some historical value in terms of music, but also rock and roll goes way beyond music. You know,
it's an attitude, it's a lifestyle, isn't it?
Yes, and it's a culture, isn't it? I mean, since the Beatles, since some bands, they kind of became mandatory subjects for history books. You can't deny the importance of rock and roll.
Yeah.
So,
I was reading when we were doing the notes for this show that rock and roll actually, some music, what do you want to call them, critics or historians have cited that rock and roll was the first genre of music that defined an era. That gave an identity to teenagers with you know, in the youth and the music that was coming out. Because something I was reading is how interesting mostly the lyrics of rock and roll music back in those days, like, you know, the late 40s, early 50s, it was very kind of trivial. It would talk about dating, sex, life, fast cars.
Yeah, basically going out and having fun. That was all about. But that was, the most rock and roll attitude you could have at that time. Is say like, I don't care about what people say. I'm going to go out. I'm going to have fun. I'm going to have it. Have fun my own way. And I think it's interesting to notice that in America, especially, you would have the R&B charts for black audiences, and you have the pop charts. Pop at the time would be like Frank Sinatra, that kind of stuff, for the white audiences. And rock and roll was the first one that kind of merged those, two audiences, especially young boys and girls. They're like, I don't care. I shouldn't be listening to this because I belong to a certain community. I want to listen to rock and roll. And it's interesting, this guy from Cleveland, Ohio, called Alan Freed, had a radio show, and he was a DJ. And he actually, some people claim he's the guy who came up with the term rock and roll, because he was playing a mix of R&B and jazz and blues, country, gospel, everything in his show, and said this is just like what I like listening to. I don't have to fit in one category, and this is rock and roll.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. You had those guys like Fats Domino and Bill Haley and his Comets, and those guys were playing the first kind of incarnation of rock and roll, and it was all about up-tempo dancing kind of
distorted
rhythms.
Guitars, amplified instruments.
But not so much distortion at the beginning. But for instance, if you listen to Fats Domino, it's more piano, but you can hear the blues. He's really cool because you can hear the blues and gospel in there more clearly. But it's another vibe. Yeah. It's more up tempo. It's more like let yourself loose. It's a completely different vibe compared to the early stuff. And then when you listen to Bill Haley, that's okay. There's guitar solos.
Yeah.
Right. And if you listen to the first, I don't know if you can call it the first rock and roll number one hit, but in 1955 we had Bill Haley scoring like a number one hit with Rock Around the Clock. I think that's really relevant. It's a milestone because you have the word rock
in the song title.
Rock around the
clock. That's something, a lot of things I was looking at and reading stuff that said that rock and roll music is actually one of the first kinds of music that sung about itself.
Yeah,
where it celebrates itself.
Yeah, it does.
I had some examples. For example, so as a continuation. So these aren't rock and roll tunes, the ones that I've noted down, but they are songs like what rock and roll did, celebrating itself. So Bubba O'Reilly, Smells Like Teen Spirit, Hey Ya, the song 1999. They're songs that celebrate music.
Yeah,
and
music that talks about music.
Yeah, exactly, and that's what rock and roll introduced. It's how many songs where you say I just want to rock and roll.
They just love Led Zeppelin's rock and roll.
That's right.
Exactly.
But I think it was interesting. You said earlier I think a key factor that isn't really attributed so much to rock and roll when we discuss it nowadays is what it did for how much it contributed to the civil rights movement. Oh, yeah. Like you said, there was the black pop charts and there was the white charts, which obviously in itself, that's not really, music's for everyone.
Maybe people didn't care about that. Maybe it was like the radio stations and the media trying to, put people and communities into music categories. Yeah. But people just want to have fun, isn't it? So, exactly. So rock and roll, that's the other really important element of rock and roll. Is a cultural thing. It's not like
it was for everyone.
It's for everyone. So if you want to dance, have a good time, rock and roll is for you.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter if you're rich, poor, etc. So no one cares. It's just about rocking yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the rock and roll, as we said, it started in the early 40s late 40s and early 1950s. From my notes, we started in the south of the USA, but what it did is it incorporated a multitude of genres, didn't it? It combined them.
Yeah.
One quote that I found really interesting that actually I thought about was that it's African musical tradition with European instrumentation.
Yeah, it's a good point. Good point.
Because there were loads of new rhythms in rock and roll.
So isn't it rock and roll the first music genre to actually combine a lot of stuff, not like combining two things. Like if you listen to early jazz and then they have ragtime and blues, but if you listen to rock and roll, it's literally everything that happened before rock and roll is included
country,
in rock and roll.
Bluegrass, gospel, R&B, even some jazz elements as well.
Yeah, sure.
It's
But if you think about one thing I want to talk about is how it changed from that early rock and roll. Let's do like a big jump in history from that time to right now. So what was rock and roll back then, and what is rock and roll right now?
Yeah.
Because it has evolved in a way, and I think rock and roll is not dead because it has evolved. It's not the same. We couldn't just be, playing Elvis songs nowadays. I mean, I still listen to Elvis. I love it.
I listened to it on the way to the gig the other day.
But we couldn't keep doing that same. Musicians couldn't just keep playing that same style nowadays and say, this is rock and roll. We can't deviate from this, and we need to stick to what Elvis did and what Johnny Cash did, whatever. No, what we're doing, what people do now, if you listen to Dream Theater, that's rock, rock and roll, prog rock, whatever. So what is for you, question for you, Lars, that defines rock and roll beyond the music? Because if you keep talking about the genres that were mixed in order to create rock and roll, then we could have a whole show just about that.
You mean aside from the music?
But aside from the musical side, why isn't rock and roll still alive? Why can we still call some sort of music rock and roll?
Well, for me, I think rock and roll is definitely an attitude and a way of life more than anything. I mean, we've already planned numerous shows, obviously in advance of what we're going to do, and we've written the albums that we want to discuss. And
have we?
I have.
Okay, thanks.
I was going to tell you after.
Thanks for doing the hard work.
But some of these albums that I've put, for example, they're not by rock and roll bands. I've got a Metallica album in there. I've got an Iron Maiden album in there. I've got an album by The Band. Which band?
Which?
The Band.
The Band? wait, that band?
Yeah.
Or the band.
The Band. Yeah.
The Band.
Yeah. Bob Dylan's band, The Band.
The Band.
Which, I mean, they're so obviously Americana, that band, and Metallica is so obviously metal, but you have to think of rock and roll as pushing boundaries, deviating from the norm, and, in a broader sense, fighting the system.
Fighting the system.
And I think with these bands who did new things, that is a fight of the system.
Yeah, so rock and roll is mainstream, but it does question the mainstream as well.
I think so. I think there's room for debate on that. I don't think all rock and roll is mainstream, nor has it been, because a lot of the time in the early 50s, when rock and roll... I was reading that a comic book came out in the early 50s. I don't know who it was written by, but it was delivered or handed out to parents in America. And the story of this comic book was that a young daughter had the choice to marry two men. She went for the guy who liked rock and roll, and the parents were distraught. And they presented her with some lovely guy who played classical music, and the parents said, you should marry this guy, not the rock and roller. And so, even the early rock and roll, parents didn't like it, just like they didn't like the Beatles early in the 60s.
Yeah. They try to kind of market the Beatles as something that could be accepted by the parents as well, but
earlier on they didn't. The parents didn't like it earlier on.
And the Rolling Stones, they did the opposite. It was like, after 2 weeks without having a shower, the Rolling Stones are arriving in America. They said something like that. It's like, because they wanted to be, against the mainstream.
So it really was opposite. The Beatles were the good boys, the parents didn't like, and the Rolling Stones were the bad boys.
But, some people would buy both, isn't it? So it's the kind of, so you could kind of try to sell rock and roll as against mainstream, as like... but regardless of what kind of attitude you're going to take towards rock and roll, it has to have an attitude. It can't just be music. Or does it have to have? But it's kind of natural for rock and roll to imply some sort of attitude. So you kind of think, well, if it's rock and roll, something's going on. It's not just the music. And when you think about punk rock, and when you think about all those bands that were just trying to be noisy and maybe try to clash with the establishment. So there's that as well. I mean, and in the 70s, all the hippies would be listening to Led Zeppelin.
Well, from the outset, rock and roll was a rebellious term, because rock and roll. Do you know what the term rock and roll means?
No.
It means sex.
Does it?
Rocking and rolling in bed.
Oh, didn't think of that. So there you go.
That's
rock and
the
roll.
slang for sex. So
That's
I don't know if it was ever. Obviously, we weren't around in the 50s, but I'm not sure if it was ever used. But I can't imagine sort of being a party and saying to some woman,
"Let's rock and roll."
Do you want to go up for some rock and roll?
Yeah.
Do you want to go back to mine for some rock and roll?
Imagine saying that on a radio or on a song. Or,
exactly.
Yeah, maybe rock around the clock was that, Rock
well,
around
I
the clock.
wouldn't put it past Bill Haley.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the kind of stuff. I mean, that's the kind of stuff you can say nowadays. If you're like, I don't know, hip hop artist, you can talk about sex or drugs or whatever without having to.
And I think we owe it to rock and roll
Yeah.
that it let us and let musicians express themselves.
Yeah, sure.
Before that, you think of all the music that came before that, it was very regimented. I mean, lyrics weren't daring. They wouldn't have been controversial. Like, back in the 30s, you had quite a lot of jazz, swing, musical songs, like from the shows, Showtime music. And they wouldn't have been daring, I don't think.
So all the rebels would be listening to rock.
Well, you've got to thank rock and roll. I mean, why can rappers sing about whatever they want now? Drugs, sex, all that stuff. Why can metal sing... we've got a band called Cannibal Corpse, whose every album is named after defiling humans and drinking their blood. I like Cannibal Corpse, by the way, but yeah, their song titles and album titles are very vulgar. But you have to think rock and roll allowed this to happen because it was the first one to push the boundaries both musically and lyrically.
So rock and roll is musical freedom.
I like that, yeah.
If you listen to Zappa, you can't really put a label in that, innit?
No.
It's musical freedom, isn't it? Musicians can do, some rock bands would play 17-minute songs and some bands would do a 1.5-minute song. But
this is why we still consider them rock and roll.
Yeah, so that's why you can have Emerson, Lake and Palmer and Metallica in the same music genre.
Well, there you have it.
Just call it rock.
I think that's a pretty good definition of what myself and Felipe would call and define rock and roll. And I like what you said there, the last line. Rock and roll is musical freedom. So it doesn't matter if you're metal, Americana, gospel, as long as you are pushing those boundaries in some way or another, maybe musically or lyrically, or even with your instrumentation. You just mentioned Zappa.
Yeah. How
many times all these instruments Zappa has in his band? You wouldn't consider any of them rock, jazz, or rock and roll. He's got kazoos in his music.
But
that's pushing the boundaries.
I don't know if Zappa would call himself a rock artist, but if he did, or if anyone who plays that sort of weird music just says, this is rock and roll, you would have to accept it.
Yeah.
Because rock has less boundaries or no boundaries at all.
And if that's the attitude they've taken to writing their music, then, like we said, it's rock and roll.
There you go. Attitude again. So
excellent.
It's all about,
Well, we thought we'd now take this little moment to tell you guys about us a bit, because, you're sat here, we've just sat talking about what is our definition of rock and roll. And you might have seen from our social media, we have posted a few things about us. So let's just talk for a few minutes, Felipe, about how we know each other, our careers, and why, and to our audience, why we are the people who you should be, or why you. Yeah, thank you for coming and trusting us with this.
Yeah, thanks a lot for being there. If you're still listening to us,
it is our opinion.
We're not that boring.
It is our opinion, but we're just going to tell you a bit about ourselves now, as to hopefully gain some more trust. Why don't you go for it, Felipe? Tell us about yourself.
Who is Felipe? I'm a drummer. That's just to start with. So I'm a rock and roll drummer.
Get out. So. I didn't know you drummed. No, sorry, no drummers on the show. Only proper musicians.
Only music. Yeah, I always wanted to be a musician, though I wasn't good enough. So
sorry, Dash, call the guitarist. I need someone else. Yeah.
Seriously, I always wanted to be a musician. Couldn't make it too complicated. Notes, chords, scales, too much for me, so I became a drummer. I actually started, I wanted to be a drummer since I was like 6 or 7, but I didn't have, the money to buy a drum kit. So my dad gave me my first drum kit when I was 14.
Oh, nice.
And back in Brazil, so I'm from Brazil, a bit far from the UK, isn't it? It takes 2 buses to get here.
I wonder if our listeners were thinking, that's a weird English accent. Where's he from?
Yeah, there's
some island up in Scotland.
No. So yeah, I'm from South America. So yeah, although I'm from South America, I've always listened to rock music since I was young. pretty much due to my dad's influence, because he was a big fan of Creedence, Deep Purple, Zeppelin, all those guys. So I grew up listening to Brazilian music, like samba and baião and all those things, and rock and roll, especially British rock and roll. So that's why I started playing professionally in Brazil when I was 17. So long story short, after a while playing tribute bands, playing that kind of stuff, I've decided to do a degree in music. So I've moved to London because I thought I want to do either in the UK or America. In the UK, I kind of felt more connected to it. So because of rock and roll.
Well, you've been listening to British bands for most of your life.
British bands most of my life. So I thought it was a good decision, and so I spent the last 7 years in the UK learning English and music, and playing and gigging. So I've played loads of gigs in London's blues scene, which I believe it's one of the most important things I did in my life, is to play with blues artists. So you learn, from the very origins of rock and roll, and you learn how you need to be good at blues to understand rock and roll. So that's one important
just
thing.
Quickly on London, I know you're talking about the blues scene, which I know obviously I know we went to uni together, but we've done a few gigs together in the London blues scene. But London itself is such a diverse area musically. I think how many famous metal venues you have in London. And you've got blues venues, jazz bars. London really is like the musical capital of England, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's always good music in,
You can turn any street in London and there'll be some good music.
Yeah, so I had I was lucky enough to play from small pubs to big music festivals over the last 7 years, and I met this guy at university, studying music, playing together.
For those who are listening, he's pointing at me.
Yeah, that's Lars. This guy means Lars. I met Lars at university. So we played together, during the university lessons and stuff like that. We wrote music arrangements together, and then we played in a musical theatre show, The Girl from Mars. Just a shout to Julia. Thanks for having us at The Girl from Mars. That was really, really cool.
Well, that really matured our relationship, didn't it? Because we were on tour together.
Yeah, exactly. So we actually became good friends during that time, and we always worked together. So so that's a bit of my story. And
Excellent.
Obviously, the last 3 years, so I joined Jack J. Hutchinson's band, and Lars owed me that one because I got him the job. Just say. So
I got you the Girl from Mars job. That's
I got you Jack's job.
And this, fair enough. This is kind of the next level. So,
let's talk about you.
I owe you half a one. Yeah, half a one.
Let's talk about you, sir.
What about me?
Who is Lazarus Michaelidis?
It's a lot less interesting in terms of the travelling arrangements. I haven't been all over the world yet.
Born and raised in London.
That's it. Yeah. So I was born in London.
Boring.
I was born in London in 1995. And quite a lot of my childhood was very music based, in the sense of, I didn't have piano lessons when I was 3 or anything like that, but I used to always love listening to what my dad listened to. And my dad, I must have exhausted the Queen Greatest Hits 1 CD, and I just loved every track on that. And I can, even now I'll tell you this is the order of all 18 songs because I loved it that much. And Queen played a massive part in my childhood because there was quite a lot of things on that album that made me question musical aspects. I'd obviously seen people strumming a guitar and singing, but I wanted to know on Killer Queen, I wanted to know how Brian May got that kind of sound on his guitar. Freddie Mercury says, he's faithful as a pussycat, and Brian May does this wow that sounds like a meow of a cat. And every time I was like, how does he do that? I was just so curious. And then on Bohemian Rhapsody as well, and I'm listening on the speakers and it comes from here. Never let me go, no, from either sides of my ear, and I'm sat there going, how does this happen? You got to remember, I'm probably 8 to 10 years old when I'm hearing this, and I'm like, this is just nuts. So Queen played a big part, and then there was one moment for me where my dad played me a 26-minute version of Dazed and Confused from The Song Remains the Same.
I love that.
And we went into the dining room in my house where the speakers were. He turned the lights off. He put our 2 comfiest chairs in the dining room, and he told me to sit back, close your eyes, and enjoy this. And he hit play, and for 26 minutes I sat there, and I was just like, holy shit. what is this? And I've just got Jimmy Page with his bow, John Paul Jones with that do do do. Just and my mind was blown.
Was that bass riff that made you want to play?
It was. It was. Do you know what? It was the same song but a different occurrence. My uncle actually played me the riff on his bass around the same time, and that's what made me want to pick up a bass. And so since then, I mean, the rest is history. Really, I just I learned the bass. I was learning my favourite stuff from the Beatles, Queen, Zappa, Iron Maiden, Metallica. Studied music for a good few years, did it at GCSE level, got my A levels in music, and then went to the Institute of Music in London where I met this guy. I'm pointing at Felipe. We studied together. I did a higher diploma and then a degree, but we met on the degree.
Yeah.
And Felipe said the rest, really. We've done functions together. We were in a jazz trio together. We've done the Britpop touring theatre show. And now we both play with rock artist Jack J. Hutchinson, and we're quite happily touring the world and playing his music and producing his new album, aren't we? And
when you put it like that, it sounds really cool.
It does, yeah. So yeah, that's us really, and a little bit of insight into who we are and why you should, or why we hope you trust us, in our opinion. But it is backed up by a lot of musical knowledge. We did. Do you know what? I remember in university we did that history of popular music lecture, which I always found so interesting because it really branched and connected the gaps between certain genres. He would say to us, okay, let's look at metal in relation to blues, and you and me were like, what? How do these connect? And then he started saying, okay, well, with blues, let's look at Sabbath's take on blues. So Sabbath, in their early album, they did some blues. There was definitely bluesy stuff in their first album, and then they got heavier and heavier. Out of Sabbath, you end up getting bands like, Iron Maiden and Metallica. And that's how the gap's bridged.
Yeah.
So it's great, isn't it, just seeing the links and the bridges.
Yeah, understanding history and understanding where those guys came from is really cool.
Well, let's take a look then as to where rock and roll came from and the origins and how it started. We discussed earlier that it was the late 40s and early 50s, the south of the USA, a culmination basically of gospel music, R&B.
I think when a new music genre starts, you have loads of people kind of naturally moving into that direction and obviously mixing up things that existed before them. So it was a natural thing that the rock and roll came about at that specific time, especially because it was easier to buy instruments as well, and the guitar was becoming more and more popular. And I believe the guitar is what for most people at the time is what defined the sound of rock and roll. As I said to you, you would have people playing the piano quite fast and doing that kind of stuff. But
I think something we should point out: electrically amplified guitar.
Yes.
I don't think you'd find many acoustic guitars in those early rock and rolls.
No,
and that's what defined it as well, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Again,
electric
pushing
guitar,
the boundaries. Getting an electric guitar in your face as opposed to a nice acoustic.
And I think at a certain point, rock and roll turned into rock. Because nowadays, if you want to just if you listen to something that sounds loud and noisy, that's the thing, isn't it? What is rock and roll? In one word, noise. Distorted guitars.
Yeah, nice noise sometimes.
Noise. Loudness and
Well, a few music historians and critics have actually cited that there has been not an exact moment, but a year with let's be generous and give a year either side of when rock and roll not changed to rock, but where the distinction came in. Yeah. And some people think that 1965 was that year. And the reason for that is because there was a big key moment, which is where Bob Dylan stopped using his acoustic guitar.
Oh, yeah, that was quite shocking at the time, wasn't it? Because, his folk fans didn't want him to just give up on the acoustic guitar, because I think he was a folk singer. I think...
But he was still rock and roll.
Well, that's the thing about Bob Dylan. He wasn't just a folk singer.
Yeah.
He was a storyteller. That's how I say it. So as a storyteller, you can tell stories in many different ways.
Yeah.
So he was changing the way he was telling the story. As his lyrics kind of got more, angry, and questioning the establishment. So it makes a lot of sense to make them slightly louder or noisier. So to make the song, So why not electric guitar? And he was a clever guy. He was like, okay, there's this kind of a new popular instrument now, which is the the guitar. So why am I? Well, it wasn't a new instrument, but it was becoming more popular, and it was like, why am I not using it? I should be using electric guitars as well. And I think that's a big question for rock and roll songwriters: is the why not? It's not about why are you going to do something. It's why not.
Yeah.
So why not playing electric guitar? So he did that. And I think, that's a really, really important moment in rock's
history. And from that moment, things started changing. Not just because Dylan did it, but again, people, I wouldn't say they were bored of what we call traditional rock and roll, but then, like you said, there's more ideas. Why not get an electric bass player in? Because you have to remember, as a bass, did I mention I'm a bass player? It's the thing about me that everyone forgets, because bass is the guy who just sits at the back. Yeah.
No one cares, I'd say, but
just get in the corner, play the root note as we tell you in time with the drums. But the bass is a new instrument. We have to remember that the bass is only about 50 years old. Yeah. Well, to now the bass is about 70 years old, which compare it to a guitar, your violins, everything. It's a very new instrument, and like we're saying here. Why wouldn't you start adding an electric? Bill Haley used an upright bass, not him, but his band. Yeah. Fats Domino would have used. Yeah, they would have all used upright basses. So the electric bass was a very new instrument, and like you said, with Dylan going to his electric guitar, why wouldn't bands have started going with some electric basses?
Yeah,
and this is just where it changed, and people started to branch off and do different things, and that's where apparently mid-60s rock and roll didn't die, but some aspects of it came and became rock.
Yeah, and if rock and roll hasn't turned into rock, it would have died. So
you think that we needed the rock to come out of it?
I think it would get boring. As I said to you, I can keep listening to Elvis until the day I die. But even Elvis reinvented himself somehow.
Yeah, he did the gospel stuff towards his later
exactly.
days,
But the thing, if he didn't do that, if he just decided to stick to a formula, it would have become boring. You can listen to the early stuff forever, but for an artist, they can't just keep doing the early stuff. If you want to, rock and roll, you've got to keep challenging yourself. Unless you're AC/DC.
Yeah.
They can keep doing the same thing forever, and people still love them, and I love them.
Not me. Sorry.
Can you say that?
No,
I shouldn't say that.
But I think what's interesting is that there's a metal band out there who actually I did really like for a long time. They're called Volbeat. And they define themselves as Elvis metal. And they've got metal music, and it's really good metal music. Some of their riffs are really cool. But the guy sings like Elvis. $16 in an and he does that, and it's got a really great Elvis tone to it. And I think what you're saying is that we can, and I do listen to Elvis quite a lot. I'm a big fan of his, and I've got a whole playlist with all of my favourites. But had it just gone on and on and on and on and not changed, we wouldn't have bands like Volbeat.
No.
Even through the direct links, the indirect links, there wouldn't be bands like, Metallica. We've just said, the natural progression of how things have gone. Maybe not Metallica, but you understand what I mean.
Yeah.
Elvis did his part in music's evolution. And if all we had was Elvis and music never got better after that, then we might not like Elvis so much because it just gets so boring and tiresome.
Yeah, exactly. And also, you've got to think that... it's all about breaking your own rules, which is something quite hard to do.
Yeah.
Some artists from other genres, they wouldn't dare to do that. Shall I break my own rules? Like, I'm famous as a country singer. I'm going to sing country like that until the day I die. I'm not going to change it. So that's what people do. I mean, in most music styles, rock and roll is about like, I'm going to challenge my own rules. And talking about that, I just want to. I'm not like here concerned about the following the chronology of history of rock. It's not what this show's all about. It's kind of, I think we're kind of trying to define what it is. What rock is. And I said something, I'm going to contradict myself in a good way now. I said, like, the distorted guitars, they play a big role in rock music. So if you listen to Rolling Stones' Satisfaction, it's like probably the most famous distorted guitar riff of all times, and it was one of the earliest, if not the first, with that level of distortion. It's a very simple thing, few notes only, but it does define what rock and roll is, and you can hear the riff like it's played during the whole song. But
can I say something? Mm-hmm. I don't think, for me, Satisfaction, I don't think that defines what rock and roll is. I think that riff defines rock.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a good example of the transition between rock and roll and rock, which means more freedom, isn't it? So the Rolling Stones were like, we're not blues anymore. We're not the kind of blues early rock. We're doing this kind of noisy thing, and the lyrics are all about questioning the establishment.
Yeah.
And again, you have the guitar as the main element, but in the same way, in the early 70s, you got Emerson, Lake and Palmer starting the first album with a distorted bass, and they didn't have a guitar player.
Really?
So yeah, Emerson, Lake and Palmer.
I haven't listened to them that much.
Keith Emerson on keyboards and piano, and Carl Palmer on drums, and Greg Lake played bass and singing.
No guitar.
He played with King Crimson before, I guess, and as bass player and singer, and then he started his own band with Emerson.
We have to do that
Palmer.
album, Court of the Crimson King. We have to do that
a good one.
Yeah,
we should do Emerson, Lake and Palmer's first album as well. It's fantastic.
We'll add it to the list.
But yeah, it does include a song with acoustic guitar at the end. But the whole thing is, rock and roll is so crazy and so free that you can have a rock band without a guitar.
That's the freedoms that rock and roll allows. Yeah. It allows you to record a rock and roll album without a guitar. We've just spent quite a bit of time saying that rock and roll is about the guitar.
And that's why I said I'm contradicting myself here.
No, but it's still a good contradiction.
Yeah, but there's no way to label that kind of music without using the word rock. You can say prog rock or heavy rock, folk rock, blues rock, but still rock.
Yeah.
Rock is there, So I believe rock's not dead yet.
No, I
Maybe
agree.
we'll never die.
I agree. Excellent. Right. So do you know what? We're going to do a few segments on this show that we hope to make sort of weekly or episodely things. First of all, please give us a follow on our social medias. The show is at Long Live RNR Pod on Instagram and Twitter. We're going to create a Facebook page as well for you guys to like and share stuff too. Myself, I'm on Instagram. I'm at Laz Unleashed. And my esteemed co-host here is at Feed the Drummer.
Feed _
the drummer. That's it. So we do that because Felipe has a passion not only for rock and roll and Formula One, but for food.
Yeah, I do.
And we often joke on tour, like when Felipe says,
all sorts of food.
What do you want to do today, Felipe? I don't know, man. I just want to eat. As long as we eat, that's fine. So we have this joke of, he'll be okay, Felipe will be okay as long as we feed the drummer. So one of our segments on this show is I thought that what we would do is we would actually feed the drummer. So I'm presenting Felipe with a plate of food here. And the plate of food is going to, in one way or another, link back to a band, a musician, or I don't want to go for a song because that might be quite hard for you. I thought about getting a pizza and making you say, "Take another little pizza, my heart, babe." But that's too hard. And we're not going to do many puns.
We're not going to go down that. No.
So this is what I've got for you. So this is on the menu today. We have Greek souvlaki. I'm Greek for anyone who doesn't know where my last name's from. And this is Greek pork that we've done on the barbecue yesterday, or my uncle did it. You cook it for a good 2 hours. How are you enjoying it?
Well, it's really good.
Yeah, good. This is proper Greek food.
It is.
What's your guess musically?
I don't want to guess, I just want to eat.
No, you have to guess.
Do I have to?
Right, you have to, or we won't do
So is there a relation between this and music?
Yes.
It's an album, a band?
Why don't you think a bit and take a few guesses, and then I'll start narrowing it down.
God, this is hard. Greek meat. Rock. Jeez.
Okay, do you know what, I'll give you the category. It's a musician.
Meatloaf.
No, that would have been good.
No, too obvious.
I would have actually made meatloaf had we done meatloaf.
Okay, still meat.
Yeah, but think about what you're eating.
God, I don't know.
No? You know what you're eating.
I know what I'm eating, yeah. Oh, God, I don't know. A band that relates to this.
A musician.
A musician, sorry, yeah. A musician.
Yeah.
A singer.
A drummer, actually.
A drummer.
Yeah.
A drummer.
Think about what you're eating.
God.
What are you eating?
What is this?
You know what it is. We had it yesterday for dinner.
Oh, does this relate to a drummer?
What meat is it?
Don't know.
What do you mean you don't know? If I tell you it's Greek souvlaki, it's Greek pork.
Pork.
Yeah.
In drama. Pork.
Do you want the answer?
No, let me think. Pork. Pork.
You're gonna. I think you're gonna hate me for this. Really,
I think
you
of
want the
Nick
answer?
Mason because of animals and that pig.
No. This is a bit more literal.
More literal.
Yeah, I wanted to go easy
Pig.
for now.
Pork. Don't know, man. You got me there.
Ready?
No.
Jeff Porcaro.
Doesn't it get more stupid than this? No, man, that's no.
It's
That's
right,
not.
Jeff Porcaro.
Pork.
That should have been the first thing you thought when I put pork down
No,
in front
it
of you.
shouldn't.
Why?
Porcaro. It's not the same thing. God.
The
No,
only
Lars.
difference is that it's a C instead of a K.
All right, next time, I'm going to eat a little bit more. Next time, I want to introduce me to a new band.
That's what I think we'll do
New
from now on.
food,
Yeah.
a new band.
What we'll do is I'll introduce you to a new band as I'm doing the food. Yeah. So if I
Feed me with music.
Feed the Drummer. Mm-hmm. There we go. That's it for this week's episode of segment of Feed the Drummer. Did you enjoy the pork?
Really good.
Good. Excellent.
Porcaro, come on. Now I'm going to introduce you to a new segment of the show called Laz and Leashed. Because, I'm Feed the Drummer on Instagram and all social media, and Laz is Laz Unleashed.
There's a reason for this name, isn't
There's
there?
a
You and
reason
Jack
why.
attribute it to me on tour.
Exactly, because whilst on the road, Lars would make some very controversial comments on, classic rock songs.
Purely opinion. It's all my opinion.
Controversial comments, that's how I call them. And you might hate him for this. He's a nice guy, so please don't hate him. So every show, Lars is going to unleash his anger and his controversial opinions about things that you might like. So
I'd like to say, though... Go on.
Disclaimer. This does not represent my opinion. And also, important to note that we don't want you to feel offended. Okay. So...
Well, I'm sticking up for the 5% of you who agree with what I have to say. Because I think a lot of what I have to say is shared. There are opinions that agree with mine, but not everyone's too scared to say it. So I'm going to say
you're going to
it.
be the voice of the voiceless.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's put it like that.
All right.
So on this week's segment of Laz Unleashed, you were talking earlier, and we did allude to it, about AC/DC. And I just want to say that I appreciate what AC/DC have done for rock music and that as rock and roll as they are, but I don't like their music. I think they're very boring, very dull. He's going.
I'm off.
Well, I said I didn't want the drummer. Dash, call the guitarist. No. I don't know. I find the guitar riffs sound very similar. I don't feel like there's much variation in guitar riffs, vocal melodies. I mean, they can play. Angus Young can play. The rhythm section are tight. I don't know the singer's name. Is it Bon Scott?
Well, yeah.
There's two of them, isn't there?
Yeah, Brian Johnson.
Both of them are brilliant. It's just never clicked to me. I've never heard a song and said, you know what, I want to listen to that again. And I hear new songs and I thought, well, that's not much different to what I heard the other time. I think there's, you know what I like? You Shook Me All Night Long. I think that's a great chorus. Other than that, I can't say I like an AC/DC song, unfortunately. So
wait a minute. Can I say that again?
Of course, yeah.
You can't say you like an AC/DC song. Is that what you just said? Apart from the one song.
You Shook Me All Night Long is listenable.
Listenable.
If it comes on at a
Ladies
party...
and gents, one of the most classic rock songs of all time
I will sum
is listenable.
I will sum it up this
Listenable.
way. Listenable.
Just that.
I will sum it up this way. If it comes on a random Spotify playlist, it will be skipped.
This does not represent my opinion.
That's how we'll end every... You have to tell me when you agree with me, though. There might be certain instances where you agree.
I would never officially agree with you because I care.
That's the whole point of this segment.
Yeah, I care about people not throwing stones at me and stuff like that. So, for my own health and safety, I would never agree with what you say during Lars Unleashed.
He might, guys. He won't say it. He has to.
You're not going to get a confession.
He has to keep his official position of not agreeing. That's fine.
You're not going to get a confession from me.
You know, some funny things when we're in the band, when we're doing stuff with Jack and talking about how we proceed. Sometimes I'll say an opinion, and Felipe's response is always, "Well, you know, it's my position to disagree with Laz and offer another opinion." But it's true, because I think we do that well, because I will offer Jack an opinion on something, and you will offer another opinion that does coincide with mine. I'll tell you, sometimes when I feel strongly about this opinion, it's a little annoying. But I think it's important for Jack to have two sides of an opinion, which is why I completely respect what you do.
Is it important for our listeners to have a second opinion about things they like?
Like what, AC/DC? Well, listen, get in touch with us on our social medias. Tell me if you disagree or if you agree or disagree with me.
Tell us how much you love AC/DC.
And those of you, the voiceless, those of you in the 1%, tell us how much you dislike AC/DC, because I'm not alone. Don't. I know I'm not alone.
I'm going to edit this out. No, this can't.
Just delete all the emails before I get them.
This is not going to make the final cut.
Excellent. Well,
but that's rock and roll, isn't it? It's to be controversial as well, and it's to kind of question whatever people like and try to do something different.
Exactly.
That's why rock and roll is not dead yet.
Perfect. Well, that brings us to the end of episode 1. Been really good talking, man. I mean, we've obviously discussed rock and roll a lot in depth on tour and whilst we were together in hotel rooms and stuff like that. But good to get our teeth into it and actually sit down and discuss and say, what is rock and roll? And I think the best way you summed it up was rock and roll is musical freedom.
Yeah.
And I don't think it can be summed up any better than that.
I think that's what this show is supposed to be all about.
Yeah.
Like freedom. We just want to talk about things we want to talk.
Yeah.
All things rock and roll, and share some of our views with people. Maybe
the bands we like.
Yeah, maybe recommend some bands as well. I think we should have. I'm just deciding this right now. We should have a playlist with all the artists we mentioned today. Why not?
Brilliant idea.
Yeah, and then share. Some of you might not know some of the songs, and some of you might know a lot more about rock and roll than we do. So give us
send us suggestions.
Feed
as well.
The drummer and the bass player.
Feed the drummer, yeah.
Send us some suggestions if you want to. If you want us to talk about some specific bands or albums as well, we want to hear from you.
Absolutely, yeah.
Want to hear from you?
We do. Like we said, we're going to do a lot of shows that will be discussing a particular album or a particular band and just cementing and explaining to you guys why we feel that this band or this album has a place in rock and roll history. So if there's any albums or bands or moments in rock and roll you'd like us to discuss, give us a message, tell us what you'd like to hear. But for now, guys, thank you so much for listening. We've been the Long Live Rock and Roll podcast. I've been Laz, and to my right has been Felipe. And get us on social medias. We are at Long Live RNR Pod on Instagram and Twitter. Felipe is at feed_the drummer, and I am at Laz Unleashed. Thank you so much for joining us and for being part of our first episode.
Keep rocking, everyone.
And as always, long live rock and roll.